Thank you everyone and welcome to the council meeting of the 8th of February 2022. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay our respects to elders past and present. We do not have any apologies this evening and we do have council, okay. Councillor Loden will be joining the meeting via Zoom but is not yet present. So we'll go to public question time and receiving of public statements and questions. I can see currently there are no members present in the public gallery, but we have received some questions in advance of the meeting. Executive Manager? Just to confirm though that they've been received.
Yes, Mayor, we have received some questions from Dudley Meyer of Highgate that's been distributed to all councillors.
Thank you. Do we need to allow question time to remain open for a few moments?
No, should no one be present, you can move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, well, this is rare, but probably not to be completely unexpected in the circumstances with cases of Omicron growing. So we will then close public question time and move to applications for leave of absence. Council members, are there any applications? There being none, we'll move to the receiving of petitions, deputations and presentations. There are nil this evening. Confirmation of minutes for the ordinary meeting of the 14th of December 2021. Can I please have a mover and seconder for the minutes? Thank you. Councillor Wallace moved, seconded by Councillor Hallett. All those in favour? Declare the minutes carried. Announcements by the presiding member. I would just like to note that given the times we're in, it's very important to say thank you to our community, particularly for people who have been attending Beatty Park, where we have had to put in place requirements around vaccination proof. That we'd like to say thank you to the community for supporting our team down there with kindness and respect. That's very much appreciated, and it's been really wonderful to move through the community to see everyone out there doing the right thing for our local cafes, restaurants, bars, etc., where that's required. The health team remains available to provide advice where needed. And so far, I think so good in the City of Vincent. So just a big thank you to everyone involved in that. I will now move to declarations of interest. CEO.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the declarations of interest I've received are already included in the meeting agenda notes and are identical to those declared for the council briefing session last Tuesday. In summary, as included in the agenda, Councillor Castle declared a proximity interest in relation to item 9.1, advertising amended character areas and heritage areas policy, Wilberforce and Kalgoorlie streets. Noting the interest is that Councillor Castle's property is adjacent to the portion of Kalgoorlie Street being proposed for character retention. And Councillor Castle, Councillor Loden and yourself, Mayor Cole, and myself all declared impartiality interest in relation to item 10.2 Britannia Reserve Lighting Project and in relation to involvement with Florida Athena Football Club as detailed in the meeting agenda.
Thank you, CEO. So we will then need to pull out item 9.1 for debate so that Councillor Castle can leave the chamber on that item. In addition to that, we do have amendments on the table for items 9.8, 9.9 and 9.11. I will now go around the table to see if council members would like to pull out any further items for debate. Councillor Hallett.
9.5, 10.1 and 11.7.
Thank you, Councillor Castle. Councillor Wallace. No, that's fine. Oh, sorry, I was just checking that your amendment was covered off. Councillor Opolo.
Thanks, Mayor. 9.2. Come back to me, please. I think there's another one.
Councillor Warner. Councillor Alexander.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yep. Yes, we've got that one. Thank you. Yep. Councillor Gontaszewski. Okay. Councillor Opolo. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll get I'll now go to the CEO to please read out the en bloc items. Got 9.3, 9.4, 9.6 and 9.7, 9.10, 11.1 through to 11.6, 11.8, 12.1, 12.2, 12.3.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I will now read out the agenda item numbers being proposed to be considered en bloc, which include items 9.3, item 9.4, item 9.6, item 9.7, item 9.10, item 11.1, 11.2, 11.3, 11.4, 11.5, 11.6, 11.8, 12.1, 12.2 and 12.3. And I'll just check that Wendy has those.
Thank you, CEO. Can I please have the council member to move the en bloc items? Move Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Castle. All those in favour? I declare the en bloc items carried. It's very simple this evening. We can move through the items sequentially tonight. So I will take us to item 9.1, noting Councillor Castle is leaving the chamber. This is in relation to the advertising of amended character areas and heritage areas policy for Wilberforce and Kalgoorlie streets. Can I please have a mover and seconder for this item? Moved by Councillor Opolo, seconded by Councillor Gontaszewski. Councillor Opolo.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this one, subject to any enlightening information from the other members of this council, I don't see any objection from my perspective, but I do wish to make a comment and raise a question, really to inform future decisions on this subject. And I do that because this item could be will be subject to planning and development applications going forward, presumably. And the fact that heritage and heritage issues and combined with the planning applications are quasi-judicial in nature, I just want to clarify some points, particularly in terms of the guidance that is coming from these documents. As we saw in December that we had a 5-4 split decision. And so the more informed we are in terms of our policy, I think this council will be more aligned in, in its voting on such decisions. So as I try and wrap my head around this, this complexity of this planning and development decisions, my understanding is that obviously we're bound by the residential design codes, which contain, amongst other things, deemed to comply requirements. That under the residential design codes, local government are permitted to adopt certain policy changes, which can change certain deemed to comply provisions under clause 7.3.1a. And that's what the administration is recommending here in relation to this proposed precinct. Importantly, these areas are limited in terms of setback, building height, street surveillance, street walls and fences and general building design. In the item prepared by administration, in attachments 1 and 2, attachments 2 and 3, is administration's policy recommendations for the changes to deemed to comply provisions in relation to this precinct. And I'll also note that these changes are only going to apply to this precinct, and that where the policy is inconsistent with the local planning scheme, the local planning scheme prevails. And where the policy is permitted to amend or replace the deemed to comply provisions under that clause 7.3.1a, then the policy shall prevail. So I guess my first question, assuming that my understanding is correct, is what would be an example of where a policy is permitted to be changed under 7.3.1a, but where an inconsistency would result in the local planning scheme prevailing?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, your understanding is correct. The only circumstance where that would apply is where the scheme specifically states that a fence height of X meters is required, or where there was a specific provision that related to built form. Currently, there are no built form provisions in the scheme. So there wouldn't be a circumstance where there would be an inconsistency at this time. But it is possible in the future if the scheme was amended to set out built form requirements.
Thanks for clarifying. I guess that's really my only question. So I had two questions. That was one of my two questions, but I also want to make a comment regarding this item prepared by administration. Under attachments 2 and 3, where you actually outlining what the change is to the deemed to comply provisions in this table, it actually doesn't show what you're changing it from. It actually only refers to the clauses that you are augmenting. And I'm just wondering, this is more a comment than anything. I think it'd be really useful for council to receive these types of things in a way that we can see what the existing deemed to comply provision is and what you're actually changing it to, rather than us having to trail through the clause references and work out what it is that we're changing. The other thing that I wanted to note is that with all these development applications and planning decisions, I guess the key document that we as a council are trying to make informed decisions on is the strategic community plan. And I know that's up for review this year, being a 10-year plan. One of the things that I found difficult when it came to heritage decisions is that this is only covered under sensitive design. And if you go to that page on page 31, looking for guidance in terms of what should drive our policy, it says, makes 2 points about the outcomes that administration / council are trying to achieve. Our built form is attractive and diverse in line with our growing and changing community. And our built form character and heritage is protected and enhanced. And to me, those two outcomes are actually kind of overlap and in many cases could be conflicting. And so when I look at whatever discretion we can apply in terms of quasi-judicial decisions, I'm looking to the motherhood documents like this, the strategic community plan, to get guidance as to how we are directing our policy and how, as a council, we need to vote. And I just wanted to table that because I found that that's really difficult to work out what it is that should be driving our policy. So that when I look at this document, for example, which is we're voting on tonight, it's hard to know whether the policy is in line with what we're trying to achieve in terms of heritage per the strategic community plan. Thank you.
Councillor Gontaszewski.
No, nothing further from me. I'm happy to support the officer's recommendation and I'm pleased to see this going forward and look forward to the next one and the next one and the next one. And happy to see the process being more streamlined. And hopefully we can go back to our diagrams and look at other streets that may be considered to be at risk and talk to the community about character in those areas.
Thank you, councillors. Any further comments? Just a brief comment from me to say that it is positive to see more character area nominations coming forward. It is probably worth noting that one nomination was received 2 years ago, and that this new process of going straight to advertising and workshopping with residents is an effort to speed up that process. Look forward to participating in the community consultation on these 2 streets. And I'd really like to have further discussions with administration about how we then explore the next streets for character retention, given that there are no further live nominations, how we can either encourage our community to do that, and whether we need to go back and look at the body of work that was done where our team highlighted streets that had very much intact character and categorised accordingly. So, yeah, very happy to support this and look forward to having discussion with residents on these 2 streets. Any further comments? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? And declare that carried. We'll ask Councillor Castle if she could please return. Welcome back, Councillor Castle. We'll move on then to item 9.2, outcomes of advertising, amendment number 7 to local planning scheme number 2, Leederville precinct structure plan. Can I have a mover, please? Moved by Councillor Gontaszewski, seconded by Councillor Wallace.
I'm happy to support this recommendation. I think it's the next step in making sure that we've got a consistent suite of planning documents for this precinct.
Councillor Wallace, councillors, Councillor Opolo.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just want to follow up, obviously, the questions that have been going back since, the ones that I raised at council briefing and subsequent clarifications. I'm happy with the responses eventually, but I guess, again, it's not really a question, but it's wanting to table that a little bit of frustration, I guess, in terms of what's being presented in front of us requires, you know, maybe 5 or 6 questions to try and really understand what the intent is of the change, particularly where the item is actually saying nothing much is changing. So, you know, I guess all councillors and this council has the obligation to make informed decisions, and the administration has an obligation to provide relevant information to help us make informed decisions. And I've just found with this example, even though I don't have a real big problem with it, hours and hours is invested in trying to understand what the intent of administration is, and 10 questions go by before I get comfortable with that. And I kind of just really tabling that I'd like, well, I think council deserves as much information about what the intent administration is trying to seek. Something that looks very like administrative in nature. The question is, why do it? And, you know, it just turns out, I was very happy with the answer in the end, to just say that it's just much easier to manage this as a project in itself, rather than trying to look at the local planning scheme and, you know, for every single development that could happen within this scheme map. So I'm happy with the answer, but I just wish that the explanation was a lot clearer on the page, and then that would probably allow us to move forward and focus our attention on other things. Thank you.
Councillors. Look, I appreciate, Councillor Opolo, that you needed to ask those questions, and perhaps as a new councillor it needed to be fleshed out further for new councillors, but I certainly didn't experience it that way, but that's because I have a long history with this matter. So that doesn't apply to all council members, but I appreciate that it applied to you, and you have every right to ask those questions. Might also be that delving into planning items in the way that you are, which is fantastic and to be congratulated. Might signal also that further induction and training will also help with some of that. Councillors, any further comments or questions? Okay, all those in favour? Declare that item carried. Item 9.5, variation of licence to Bonnie Brewery Proprietary Limited, part of road reserve adjacent to number 3639 Beaufort Street, Mount Lawley, corner of Grosvenor Road. Can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Moved by Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Alexander.
Thank you. Just through the Mayor, just if I can just ask a question about the response in the briefing notes about the signage and being a public space. And can I just seek some clarification as to whether, obviously it's far more obvious in an alfresco spot in a town centre, and when we have parklets, they're signed specifically. Was it an oversight that we don't have signage, and is it something we can implement at some point, or is it under the licence agreement that it's not necessary?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Our standard for parklets is that part of the policy that we will have a sign stating that they're public spaces. We don't have the same approach when it comes to licensed spaces throughout the city. So that was the reason why that didn't occur. There's nothing stopping it from occurring. The license doesn't require it, and so at this point it would just be a request of the operator whether they would be willing to put some signage up to make sure it's clear that in the mornings no one's using it and it's free, and all other times is a public space as well.
Thank you. And would that potentially be at city cost then, if given that it's not part of the license agreement?
Through Mayor Cole, potentially. I mean, the operator may be willing to do it at their cost, so that would be where we would start. But it wouldn't be a significant cost. It'd be pretty minor to have that kind of signage put up.
Thank you. Happy to support the officer recommendation, albeit I didn't vote for the original one, but I think this is a sensible and a good outcome to have a greater level of amenity in the space rather than just a flat space. So yeah, happy to support it.
Councillors, was seconded by Councillor Alexander. Thank you.
Yes, I support 1 and 2. I think it just seems to be fairly standard practice, and I'm sure occurs in a lot of other areas of the city.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Any further comments on this item? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried. On to item 9.8, outcome of advertising and adoption of new election signs policy. Can I have a mover and seconder, please? Moved by Councillor Wallace, seconded by Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm generally supportive of the intent of the policy. So, over the last couple of elections, I've observed there's been a number of complaints relating to the number and placement of candidate election signage. A review of the policy is needed. I characterise the complaints that I've seen as generally concerned with nuisance, that there's been a proliferation of signs across the city during election periods, kind of beyond what people think is acceptable. The policy is attempted to address that and also to manage safety issues around pedestrians and vehicles. But I think the policy goes too far in its attempts to address this. I'm requesting in the briefing a study of which areas would be prohibited from signage. No answer was provided by admin. This was disappointing on a couple of fronts. It was a pretty good faith question that wouldn't have taken much effort to respond to. And second, I think it suggests the policy was being put forward with a set of very restrictive general prohibitions, and the impacts of these were not understood by administration. Privately, I've had a look at Beaufort Street as an example and found that a very small 20-metre strip of Beaufort south of Brisbane was the only location along the whole strip where election signage would be permitted under this policy as drafted. And I presume there'd be a pretty similar outcome throughout much of Vincent. On that basis, I'm proposing to remove the clauses relating to distance to intersections and other similar restrictions, as I think the safety aspects of sign placement are managed within other clauses, including those around not creating obstructions and maximum permissible size. the clauses that I'm seeking to delete as drafted also contradict our own practices when it comes to sign placement. Eco signs surrounding Birdwood Square and Beaufort and Bull are a good example, but there's many throughout the city. On the other side of things, to manage nuisance, I'm proposing a cap of 20 signs per candidate, which would be my guess of where signage would be perceived as becoming a nuisance, but it's open for debate. So on that basis, I'm not supportive as drafted and have an amendment ready to go.
Okay, so we're just on the substantive, so I'll go to the seconder first. Do you have any comments? Sorry? Not on the substantive, okay.
No.
Okay, does anyone wish to comment on the substantive first before we go to the amendment? Councillor Alexander, did you wish to, or do you want to talk to the amendment? Okay. Councillor Wallace?
Thank you. To delete clauses 2B, 3, 4, 5 and 8 and rename the remaining subclauses accordingly, and to add a new clause 2C, which would read, in the application of clause 2B, no more than 20 signs per candidate is permissible on city land each election period.
Is there a seconder for the amendment? Seconded by Councillor Castle. Go ahead.
I think I've said my piece on it, but interested to hear what everybody else has to say.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a couple of questions for administration. If this amendment were to be passed, I note that part of the reason it's not supported by administration is because it doesn't align with City of Stirling's policy. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on the difference between block sizes and space between intersections in the two areas, and whether you think that's actually a valid reason for them to be the same.
Through the chair, the policies in respect to each local government will depend on their environment. It's a given that Stirling has a broader urban environment, a more diverse urban environment, and they'll be looking at having a policy that generally applies across its local authority. It is a given that in respect to Vincent, it's a much higher or much more dense residential area, and that the application of the policy based on Stirling's, well, first of all, it's acknowledged that application of the policy based on main roads is probably not appropriate in respect to City of Vincent, and some reduction of restrictions in respect to Vincent is appropriate. I think that the restrictions applied by the City of Stirling is probably appropriate for the City of Vincent's urban environment. The intent was to apply the policy with the forthcoming federal election and see how well that goes, and depending on feedback from candidates on its application, to potentially amend the policy to make it more functional. But it is acknowledged from Councillor Wallace's amendment that the original restrictions aren't appropriate given the Vincent's density arrangements.
Thank you. And just a question around the application, the second part of the amendment to say no more than 20 signs per candidate. What kind of resourcing would that require to enforce? Would we just be relying on members of the public making a report, or would you expect that we need to make those counts ourselves?
Through the chair, past application or policing or enforcement of policy has been based on complaint. The city receives complaint, investigates it and pursues it accordingly. We don't have enough resources to do a check through that process.
Thank you. Look, I'm supportive of this amendment. I think that we are trying to get it right in terms of the balance of how much signage is appropriate in Vincent. I think this probably does go a little bit too far in the other direction. I note that administration have mentioned that the upcoming federal election will be a good chance to test the policy, and I think we could probably test that without these restrictions in place and review as a result of that. So yes, I'm happy to support.
Councillors, Councillor Arthur.
Thanks. Just a question. I agree signs are a nuisance and I don't like them either. My question is regarding the limit that this amendment is adopting with the limit of 20 on city land. So city land means all land held in fee simple under the care, control and management of the city and includes road reserves. So my understanding was most signs weren't allowed on city land. The only time, from my understanding, that could be considered city land is where the residents, we had to get permission from residents to put it on the verge in front of their house, which I presume is city land, and that would be the only example where signs on city land would be permissible. And is that what we're trying to limit, the 20 effectively on verges?
Councillor Apollo, this is about road reserves and public land. So you wouldn't be able to put a sign on a person's verge without their approval, not because it's public land, but because it would indicate that that person supported your election campaign. And if they didn't, I'm sure they would not be very happy to host a sign. So I think this is more around saying no signage in parks and where they can go on public road reserves. My understanding is that this does not relate to verges at the front of private properties. It is city land, yes, but by virtue of the fact that it's a verge in front of a private home, as with residents having rights to say who can park on their verge, I'll get governance to answer because you look dissatisfied with my response. I'll go to governance to answer.
The intent is for the policy to also include election signage on road reserve, but there's generally provisions that signage in front of a residence, and I'm just trying to see in the policy, would require the support of the adjoining property owner, but I'll just checking the policy at the moment.
Do you need a bit of time to do that, Executive Manager? Because perhaps in the meantime, it might be worthwhile going to another council member, Councillor Gondaszewski.
Thank you, Nicole. For the record, I think it would apply to verges on the basis of the current policy. However, you're probably unlikely to get a complaint, therefore triggering a compliance action if the resident had a... Anyway, that's my interpretation. So I don't particularly like signage on private city-owned land, city-managed land, road reserves. However, I do think that the way that the policy is currently written basically should just have a provision that says no signage rather than here are your provisions. So I understand the frustration of Councillor Wallace because this has been something that you've raised a number of times. So I understand why an amendment's coming forward. I probably would prefer the alternative that amendment that administration seems to have put forward in their response, which changes the distance by which on which a sign can be erected from an intersectional thoroughfare, of a thoroughfare from I think it's 50 down to 10. Rather than removing distance and having the 20 limit, simply because I feel that where a resident is aggrieved at the placement of a sign in their local area, they actually don't necessarily care what's going on in the federal election on the other side of Vincent or in a local election on the other side of their ward. They actually care more about what's going on their street and whether that's allowed or not allowed. And so I think the way that the amendment is worded, the only recourse that the city would have ultimately really is to be able to say, to make a judgment about whether it's causing an obstruction, which I think in some ways is challenging, or to say, well, go and count the signs, and if there's more than 20, then, you know, we can get rid of one or whatever. So I don't think I can support this as it's written, because I do think that we're going to have a federal election and they are incredibly well-resourced campaigns. And so I'm not super keen to see what could happen with free rein and election signage in Vincent. But should it not get up and another one was to come forward with those other ones, I would be supportive of some change there. So I just wanted to set out that.
Councillors, just some comments from me, because I'm not sure. I understand the intent and I'm supportive of that. And just for the record, I have never placed a sign in the public realm. It's always been with the consent of a owner on private land. But there are some scale issues here. If it limits a candidate to 20 signs, and that's a ward candidate, that's quite different from a mayoral candidate who has to display signage across the entire district. And there's also the scale of what does that mean for state and federal elections. And this has been advertised as it is. And I imagine if this was re-advertised, which we're not suggesting that we're doing as part of this amendment, the major political parties who are running state and federal elections would probably have submitted some feedback on this if it was advertised as is, because it is potentially a change to how they can advertise during a election. And I think when we previously looked at this, former councillor Joan Vatakis would often raise, my memory's a little foggy here, but the case law around political signage, and that it is does have a purpose as part of the democratic process. So I think there is some requirement for us to not clamp down too heavily on it. So I support the intent, but I think that in terms of it actually being put into practice, there are some issues that I could foresee with that, and probably similar to Councillor Gondaszewski, I would prefer tweaking of the distances, which I think would be provide more rhyme and reason to residents about where signage can go, rather than just having 20 signs in places which may be problematic. So I guess in some way I'm not supporting the amendment. Councillors, did you have a response, Executive Manager, at this point for Councillor Ipolo?
Thank you, Mayor. The policy is silent in respect to requesting permission from the adjoining landowner on having a sign on their verge, but the principle would be if the city received a complaint in respect to it and was hindering the ability for the adjoining landowner to either park on it or do anything else, we'd seek its removal.
Yes, Councillor Ipolo.
Thank you. I appreciate that the moral thing is that you would ask for permission to put it on a verge in front of somebody's house, totally. What I had asked is that that's technically city land. So if this amendment got passed, then whether you've got permission or not, and you wouldn't do it unless you got permission, but it's basically limiting 20 signs on verges in front of people's houses. So if that was excluded from this, I'd be supportive of it. If it, so I guess that's the point I'm making.
Thank you. Councillors, anything further on the amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? All those against? Sorry, I just need to see Dan. Councillor Loden, 1, 2, 3, 4. Voting against. Yeah, I need to cite Wendy. I can't see Councillor Loden. Thank you, Councillor Loden. The amendment is not carried. We're back to the substantive motion. Are there any further amendments? Any further amendments? Councillor Hallett.
Can I move to amend the distances as per admin's comment to reduce them? Because I do support the intent of Councillor Wallace's provision, but I was concerned about the 20.
Is everybody clear what the amendment is? It's contained in the second last paragraph of administration's comment for the public who, if anyone is tuning into the meeting, it is that signs erected at least 10 metres from any intersection of thoroughfares. The current provision is 50 metres. Not closer than 50 metres to a signalised intersection or before any speed indicated sign, with the current provision being 120 metres, or not located in or within 50 metres of a 40-kilometre school zone, with the current provision being 150 metres. Okay, is there a seconder for this amendment? Seconded by Councillor Warner. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Hallett? Councillor Warner? Any speakers? Councillor Alexander.
I just want to ask a question. Further up in the administrator's comment, it says you can't have a sign within 0.5 metres from the footpath. That would basically mean that no one could have a sign on their fence, or, you know, right up against their fence, but inside. Would have to be that far back, which would be a bit weird if you couldn't put it on the inside of your fence looking over. So I'd agree with the rest of it, but I think that 0.5 metre should be some mention that it can actually be on the fence, but maybe the pole on the inside of the fence.
Councillor Alexander, would you like to get some clarification from the executive manager? Is the case that if you put a sign on a fence on private property and that was within half a metre of a footpath, what would the position be?
Using a pragmatic approach through the chair, if the sign was actually on the fence, I'd consider it on private property. I wouldn't consider it being on the verge. If it was a freestanding sign that was potentially going to cause obstruction, then we would deal with it according to that.
Councillor Alexander, does that assist?
Yeah,
do you have any further comments?
Yeah, if that 0.5 metres becomes silent, then that's okay, yeah.
Anything further, Councillor Alexander?
No.
Okay, councillors. Councillor Apollo.
I just want to clarify Councillor Hallett's amendment. So I thought that you were saying that you're supporting the intent of Councillor Wallace's thing, but what is proposed is weakening the position. Is this what the amendment is? It's going from 50 down to, so it's going from 10 to 50 metres. So you're not permitted to put a sign within 50 metres. No, I'm confused.
Councillor Apollo, you need to ask questions of administration.
I didn't understand the amendment.
Okay, would someone like to outline the amendment?
Thank you.
Through the chair, administration's initial recommendation has been amended or proposed to be amended to reduce some of the distances. So in respect to placing a sign within, sorry, I'm just trying to get the exact current ones. In respect to a sign being erected at least 50 metres from any intersection of thoroughfares, that's been reduced to erected at least within 10 metres of an intersection or thoroughfare. In respect to the officer's original recommendation was not closer than 120 metres to a signalised intersection or 70 metres before any speed indicator sign. The amendment proposes within 50 metres of a signalised intersection or 50 metres of any speed indicator sign. And in respect to subclause 8, where the officer's original recommendation proposed that a sign not be located within 150 metres of a 40-kilometre-hour within or in or within 150 metres of 40-kilometre school zone. The amendment proposes that it's not located or within 50 metres of a 40-kilometre school zone.
So the amendment is weakening the policy in terms of that's what I'm confused about. If that's the case, this amendment is weakening making it more easy for signs to be erected.
That is correct.
Councillors, any further comments in relation to this amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? All those against? I declare that carried. 5-4, is that correct? Governance? Missed it, vote. Do you need to say it again? Okay, those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, 6 in favour. Councillor Opolo, myself and Councillor Loden against. I declare the amendment carried. We're back to the substantive. Are there any further comments on the substantive motion? Okay, we'll put it. All those in favour? All those against? I declare that carried. Okay, that takes us to item 9.9, advertising of amended policy, council members continuing professional development. I have a mover and seconder for this item, please. Moved by Councillor Wallace, seconded by Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, Nicole. I don't have much to comment on this policy, but I understand it's an amendment that's been put forward by yourself that I'm happy to bring forward, unless there's any other comments on the substantive.
Go to the seconder, Councillor Hallett, any comment? Okay, go ahead, Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Nicole. I'd like to move the amendment on the yellow paper, which changes the recommendation to read that council approves the proposed. Do I need to read this out?
I think as long as everyone's clear what it is that we're voting on, it will appear on the screen when Wendy brings that up. There it is, so people streaming can now see it. Is there a seconder for the amendment? Seconded by Councillor Hallett.
I'll reserve my right to speak on it.
Councillor Hallett. You'd like me to speak to it? Sure. Look, it's sort of outlining the reason, but basically when I reviewed the policy, I thought that clauses talking about accommodation, travel, cash allowances for things like doing your laundry when you're on an international conference, and when you take your friend or partner with you, that they can perhaps only attend a conference dinner with you. I thought this just isn't the reality of life in Vincent. And in fact, in 2014, we had a ban on council travel, which was part of some pretty significant budget restraint at that time. But since that time, since 2014, I think we've had one council member attend interstate conference, which I think was free attendance and self-funded for all travel and accommodation. So the other rationale is that with the reform agenda and with our own agenda, we are moving towards a focus on council capacity building, and that's always, the intent there is that for that to be localised and group training. And given that we're still experiencing a COVID-19 pandemic and that there will be budget pressures that come with that, I guess I was questioning whether we should advertise a policy that had numerous clauses that just weren't custom and practice or priority for this council. Also, the policy does need to be reviewed after every ordinary council election. So therefore, it is a policy that's reviewed relatively regularly, and if circumstances change, a new council could review this with fresh eyes. Any comments on the substantive motion before you? Okay, well, I'll put it, all those, I'm sorry, this is an amendment. I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? You do wish to speak? Yes, okay.
Can I just ask, is the same, this amendment is looking for removal of certain things. Is the same policy in place for employees of administration?
Through Mayor Cole, we have a budget for staff training. There might be some circumstances where a staff member would benefit from attending a training or seminar or conference somewhere else in Australia rather than WA, and we'd consider that on a case-by-case basis if that was going to benefit the city.
Councillors, any further comments before I put the amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? Declare that carried. We're back to the substantive. Are there any further comments or amendments? Okay, I'll put the substantive motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried. Thank you. Okay, the next item is 9.11, submission on proposed reforms, Local Government Act 1995. Can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Anyone who hasn't moved an item tonight? Councillor Castle, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the work that's gone into preparing this submission, and note that there was quite a tight timeframe, which hasn't given us the same opportunities that we normally have to talk to the community and talk amongst ourselves about this. But for the most part, I'm happy with the response that has been prepared, with the exception of an amendment that I have on the table, and I note another one on the green. Happy to let others speak though before I move that.
Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Happy to support the recommendation as is. The types of reforms that have been proposed, most of them have been discussed for a number of years, and we've had a number of chats in workshops over the last few years when they were first brought up. There are some newer ones in this, and I think the city's response is adequate to provide some direction to WALGA. And I will be supportive of amendments to change a couple of items as Councillor Castle has mentioned.
Councillors, any further comments? Councillor Opolo.
Thanks. I'm not going to support or subject to any other comments from councillors. I'm not going to, I'm unlikely to support it only because I feel like while I do support reform in local government, I feel like it was been kind of rushed, and we certainly as a council haven't, and administration haven't given our community an opportunity to really engage on the subject. And I know that we've received some lengthy comments from some people in relation to this agenda item, and I think there's some good points have been raised. So whilst the reality is I'd probably support most of the reform matters, just the fact that we as a council haven't been able to workshop it within the very brief time permitted, and that we haven't really engaged with community, I just don't feel that I can make an informed decision to support it at this time with the amount of time we've had.
Councillors, any other comments? Councillor Wallace.
Thanks, Nicole. I am really sympathetic to the new councillors like this. You know, getting your head around local government, it took me a good 18 months or so. And then to be confronted with an extremely large and broad package of reforms early on is quite difficult. I guess for some context, the Local Government Review Panel released their report last year. There was an extensive consultation through that. And yeah, I do feel comfortable with the reforms that have been proposed generally. I feel like, I guess, having the benefit of being on council for another 2 years, seeing these coming over a long time, had a lot of time to consult with admin and the community, and yeah, do feel comfortable supporting them. Thank you.
Councillors, Councillor Warner.
Sorry, I just wanted to agree with Councillor Aropolo about it's a shame. It is very fresh to us as newbies to get our heads around it, and I really appreciate what Councillor Wallace is saying about there has been consultation in other forms leading up to this, but how he appreciates the fact that it is brand new to us. And whilst we most likely agree with these reforms, they are brand new to us to try to get our heads around.
Thank you, Councillor Warner. Look, I'll speak to it briefly. It's really interesting from the perspective of someone who's been involved for 8 years and who was a council member at the time that City of Vincent, through former Mayor John Carey, took a paper called Raising the Bar with a lot of the, probably I'd say the transparency and accountability part of the package to forward to Walga State Conference to try to get traction on bringing some of those reform ideas to local government back in 2014. At that time, Vincent was really leading the way in taking steps forward in being more transparent and accountable, doing things like the live streaming, having a developer contact register, putting lots of registers online, making sure that, and then, when CEO joined City of Vincent, came to council and said he'd like to release KPIs publicly. So from my experience in local government and from seeing that early driving force back in 2014 and seeing that not particularly well received in the local government sector, I feel this is very exciting for the sector, and it's something that when you look at those accountability and transparency reforms required, City of Vincent can pretty much tick most of those boxes and say we did that from the period of 2014 to 2022, and that experience is now captured. And I think any local government that had concerns about what that would mean for them and their council, I would talk to them about all the benefits that come through having those things in place. I think also the package talks about early intervention, and they talk about having a model of monitors and inspector, and I really value that as well, because I think well, it hasn't been the Vincent experience when you look across public sector where there, across local government where there have been issues with dysfunction and just not being able to, deal with issues as they arise. There has sort of been a process that is quite legalistic and technical, and it gets to a point where commissioners are called in and the council's pretty much either suspended or expelled. And this is actually a model that would allow monitors to come in and act as mentors and try to bring people together and be respectful of the democratic elected representatives in place and try to work with them to enable them to continue, as opposed to bringing commissioners in and an inspector taking on a role to oversee that and take on some further responsibilities. I've read through a lot of the material that has been sent through from people like Lcri Grant, through the local elected members association, through Andrew Main, who provided a submission to us at the briefing last week. That talks about things like the fact that there'll be introduction of the ability to have criminal proceedings against council members. I think that's a misreading of what's being proposed. Basically what it says is that where the inspector is brought in after monitors have come in to try to negotiate and mediate, and the inspector then has to step in if that hasn't worked. If the inspector uncovers issues that cause concern that could be criminal behaviour, that is then handed on to the appropriate authorities in the same way that commissioners would do, or the CEO would do, or even a whistleblower that's working within the city as an employee would be able to do. So there's no additional criminalising of behaviour. It's simply saying the inspector can refer on where that is found. So that to me doesn't cause any alarm in the slightest, and is as it should be. So I think from the City of Vincent's perspective, where we are in our accountability and transparency journey, it's extremely comfortable for us. In fact, there's very little resources and effort that we'll have to go to meet this, and it's probably not giving us much to aim for, because in some ways we're already there. But this is really about trying to address issues within the sector and build more trust and faith and confidence in the communities that local government serves. So I think that this is a good thing for local government, and I think that Vincent should feel proud of where we are and that we can be seen as an example in this, and that we're the better for it, for having gone down that path, and extend any invitation to any concerned councillors, mayors or local governments to embrace it and go with it. And I think this will be a healthier sector with better intervention models and more supported for democratically elected members to continue in their roles, rather than having to come in at the time where they're being replaced by unelected commissioners. Councillor Alexander.
Two things. Firstly, I had the opportunity to meet with some of the officers last Friday and Mayor Cole and discuss the reforms, and everyone else's different input, and I've tried to get across it, and you read Andrew Main's stuff and Graham's stuff and some of the background to it, and you still struggle to get your head around a lot of it. But Mayor Cole, you mentioned that if this did go forward, there would still be the opportunities to workshop a lot of it, and it's not set in stone, because I see some of the things in it that worries me about, amalgamations, and, it seems to disempower elected members somewhat in favour of administration. And, it does say that it's the most important reforms in 25 years. And, I have so many questions, which, I think Councillor Cullett and Wallace mentioned that you've had plenty of opportunity to go across it. But Mayor Cole, perhaps you can just reiterate those comments about the process, that if this, and I presume it does go forward, what opportunities that elected members have to be involved in ensuring that the roles and responsibilities that we think should be had in local government, we get the chance to do something about it.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Yes, and as Councillor Alexander mentioned, whilst we didn't have time to hold a workshop on these issues, we did invite council members to a meeting on Friday, which at the request of Councillor Alexander, and I was happy to attend that meeting, and it was a good discussion that took place there. And what I was referring to at that meeting was around the greater role clarity, which is section 5.2 of the reforms, and talking about the mayor or president role, council role, elected member, councillor role, and CEO role, and talks about the fact that that those roles, they do want to bring greater clarity to those roles, but it is proposed that there will be it says here, while input and consultation will inform precise wording, it is proposed that the Act is amended to generally outline that the council is responsible for ... So my understanding is that when it comes to redefining in legislation those roles and responsibilities, which is quite critical, that will be subject to further consultation. I'm just going to check with the executive manager that that's what was discussed, and that understanding is shared with administration.
Thank you, Mayor. I share that view. The clarity of roles and responsibilities between councillors, the mayor, council as a body, and the administration is critical to making sure that there's good governance. The city has its governance framework, which outlines that as a principle, and I believe that the clarification of those roles will potentially be, or I'm hoping, subject to further consultation, because it is a critical element in respect to the reforms.
Councillor Alexander, did you have any further questions or comments?
Yeah, is it possible, if this is to go forward, which is basically the administration's work with, I guess, some input over the years from more mature councillors, for the want of a better word, should it go with some clarifications to say, we require the opportunity to be part of the process going forward with regards to roles and responsibilities and other things that elected members think are important? Because it seems to be a great leap of faith just to tick it off and send it forward, because it's been a pretty rushed process from what I can see.
Through Nicole, just a quick comment on the process. Not all, but a number of the proposals here would require legislative change, which is not a fast process at the best of times. So that would be another public opportunity to engage during that legislative process, and the voice of elected members would probably be represented by WALGA in that case, and through the City of Vincent, through our representatives to the WALGA zone. The state government will be looking to fine tune, because some of the proposals here are concepts without the detail of how it's going to be implemented. So there'll be a lot of liaison with WALGA to fine tune what that looks like when it hits the print for legislative amendments. I would expect this to be a year or two in this before it is gazetted and becomes a requirement for local governments to abide by.
Council, also just noting on page 5. Under 5.2 on page 23, and I think that's probably the individual item numbering. It does state when it's dealing with that item 5.2, greater role clarity, that these proposed roles will be open to further consultation and input, and they are contained in legislation in the Local Government Act. So any change to what's there would have to be through legislative change.
It just makes me uncomfortable when I see that a member of the DLGSC needs to be on the CEO selection panel. I won't make any derogatory comments about state government appointments, but I wouldn't actually like to see that sort of interference coming into local government. Anyway, that's getting into the detail. Thanks.
It's okay. I mean, you are entitled to put forward amendments if there's anything that you wish to put forward.
Look, I feel somewhat underprepared, because I've tried to get my head around all of this, but if I could abstain, I would. But I do have some issues with just sending it forward without a whole pile of caveats on it. Thanks.
Thank you, councillors. Any further comments, Councillor Castle?
Can I move an amendment, please?
Sure. Can I have? Is it the
one on the
purple? On the purple,
pale purple.
Is there a seconder for the amendment, please? Seconded by Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to give a bit of background to why I think this amendment is necessary. In my time on council, there's been several discussions about the implementation of a separate waste charge. The reasoning for that would be to raise awareness about the cost of waste and to perhaps lead to some better outcomes in waste behaviours amongst our residents and ratepayers. When that has been discussed in the past, I've had reservations about whether separating out the waste charge actually will have any tangible outcome or benefit to the city, because there's not really been any strong evidence that's presented that actually shows how that would result in better outcomes. But the real sticking point that I've had with this separate charge is in the way it impacts on pensioners. Currently, for those who haven't been through the exciting process of a budget, I discovered in the first year that the pensioner rebate scheme only applies to the charge of rates. If we were to separate out a waste charge, that would not be subject to the 50% rebate that pensioners can access. So this would actually have a disproportionate impact on pensioners who can no longer get 50% back on the entire rates that they pay. It would only be on the rates minus the waste charge. And given that I haven't been convinced that the waste charge itself will lead to anything tangible in terms of better outcomes, my position has always been that that's not warranted to have that impact on pensioners without a clear benefit to the city and to our waste services. So rather than just request clarification in the report as it currently stands, I think we need to have a stronger position that is to say that if it is proposed that we have a separate waste charge that does not attract the 50% rebate, then it's not supported in Vincent. If as it's expressed in the amendment, if there was a situation where the waste charge was separated out, but it still was capable of attracting the 50% rebate, then I don't have as much of a problem with it. But I think it's important that we make that position clear at this point in the process.
Councillor Wallace? Nothing to add. Councillors, any debate on the amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? Declare that carried. We're back to the substantive motion. Councillor Gonchevsky.
I'd just like to move the amendment on the green related to the introduction of compulsory voting.
Councillor Hallett is seconding the amendment.
This amendment was requested by the Mayor, but I will just say that I think part of these processes is ultimately that we can advocate as well as comment on what's presented before us. So I'm supportive of this amendment to advocate for moving towards the introduction of compulsory voting.
Councillor Hallett.
Just to quickly add, I guess perhaps being one of the few around the table and in the community that do get passionate about local government, I think it's really sad that we don't have higher rates of turnout. And so I think anything that would increase people's, I guess, engagement and just put local government on the radar would be really beneficial for broader democratic engagement, but also just an understanding of what the role of local government is.
Councillors. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I'm supportive of this amendment. I think, as others have said, it's an opportunity for us to put our position, even though it wasn't proposed as part of the reforms. I think some people were certainly expecting it to be. So it's a good opportunity to state our position. I also think that preferential voting and compulsory voting really go hand in hand, and one without the other may see some rather strange outcomes. And as Councillor Hallett said, anything that we can do to increase participation in elections and engagement with local council, I think is a good thing.
Councillors, Councillor Iapolo.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a little bit of concern with this amendment, only because I've read a little bit of commentary about compulsory voting in local government, and that literature talks about the opportunity where if there is apathy, and that's why people don't vote. If you force them to vote, it can lead to outcomes where people try to buy votes, and that to me doesn't give a good outcome, because if you force people to vote, but there's some horse trading going on, then that's not something that we would want. So it's quite a big amendment that's being proposed, and I'd have some concerns to that. So yeah, I'd have some reservations about it.
Councillors, any further comments? Look, I'll speak to it. This is really an advocacy piece because I'm pragmatic and a realist, and I understand this is not part of the reforms that are being put forward, but I'm a compassionate believer in compulsory voting at all levels of government. I think that this is a way to provide people with the democratic gift of voting. And I think that when you do make voting compulsory, then it naturally leads to people wanting to form a view on which way they're going to vote. There's always the option of a unfortunate donkey vote for those who really do not wish to participate. But I think when you look at the numbers across local government, and Vincent's been stuck in the 20% for some time. I think it was really exciting when the City of Vincent reached over 50% one election. I think that was Brad Pettit's last election. I thought that was outstanding, but really when you're looking at those figures, you do think there is a problem here. The numbers are so low. I'm not concerned about buying votes and etc., because that would be a corruption of the electoral system. And I think that Australia is a very strong democracy.
Yeah, I just missed everything after. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners. If you could just repeat that, that would be great.
Which bit did you miss?
Just from we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, but everything.
We'll have to redo the whole meeting. So we're just calling the vote on the amendment on the green. Did you have any comments or questions on the amendment, Councillor Layden?
No, thank you.
Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? All those against? Declare that carried with Councillor Wallace and Councillor Oplow voting against. We're back to the substantive. Are there any further comments in relation to local government reform? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Councillor Oplow and Councillor Alexander voting against. I declare that motion carried. Moving on to item 10.1, Monmouth Street Reserve Ecozoning, results of consultation. Can I please have a mover and seconder for this item? Moved by Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Castle.
Can I ask a few questions first? Just in terms of, I'm wondering if in terms of our public open space strategy, what level of park would this be classified as, and what would be the expected level of amenity to be provided?
Through my call, I need to check that. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
There's been some concerns raised about the consultation not asking for broader feedback on the type of amenity that they wanted rather than just 2 eco-zoning proposals. Can you just confirm the reasoning for only 10 grand being put on budget for the location?
Through my call from memory, the $10,000 for Ecozone was already on budget. And council made the decision not to sell the land. Administration was instructed to use that budget, consult with the public on an eco-zoning project. So that's the history to it. It was already on the budget.
Thank you. I mean, my understanding was that it was specifically an eco-zoning initiative only. It wasn't about reviewing the entire space for what type of park it could be, which I know is disappointing for some local residents, but I guess that was the intent set by council in the budget. Can I just ask a question also about the tree planting on the street? There was a response in the briefing notes about our street tree policy that trees should be planted to ensure consistency of street tree species in the applicable street, subject to community consultation, where an entire street is to be planted. Do you have I guess, the rationale for why we go with the same tree in a street? Is it aesthetic? Is it a budget related rationale, or is there another reason?
Through my call, it's not budget related, it's aesthetic. I've looked at that street. I think every tree's a jacaranda. There's a gap in front of this particular small park, and in line with the policy that the administration are recommending, the jacarandas planted just to fit with all the other trees on the street.
I just made recall the park would be classified under the city's POS strategy as a local open space. The minimum amenities would be turf, paths, bins, seating, lighting, and natural shade.
Thank you. Which sounds relatively similar to what is proposed, and nothing's precluding us doing something else in the future, but noting that is the budget that has been put aside for it. I'm happy to support the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Hallett. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Matt. Caught up in my mask. Yes, look, I'm happy to support. I do understand that that perhaps there might have been an expectation in the community that this was an opportunity to ask for a higher level of amenity to be provided in this park, but that is not what was budgeted, and it's also not what was consulted on, because this was proposed as an eco-zoning project. And I note what Councillor Hallett has said, that there may be options in the future to add further amenity, but at this point I think what has been proposed is appropriate.
Councillors, Councillor Gontaszewski and Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, look, I have some concerns that if we don't sign off on this and get started today, that this leads to a protracted period of nothing. That just comes from being, and I mean, you know, I've got, you know, sort of a number of T-shirts that I like to wear, or hats that I like to wear, and one is about engagement. So that's not lost on me that there are some members of the community that are asking for us to go back and redo engagement before taking action. But after a number of years and sitting in this chair, a lot of the times that I've thought back with, regret may be too strong a word, but it's the times when we could have made a decision and we didn't. And there's been times where we have made some decisions, and I think it's ultimately ended up being positive. I don't believe what's on the paper is particularly restrictive. Should any ideas come forward from the community in future in relation to, you know, if there's a community art project that the community wants to get together and do, or there's a group of people who want to, you know, approach the city about, you know, garden beds for a veggie garden or something like that. I think the city would be able to accommodate those things. But what I'd really like to do is to ultimately see some additional shade, some additional amenity added to this park, and then the users of this park can sit there, enjoy some quiet peace, and have a think about how they could use this public space to benefit their community. So I am supportive of the officer recommendation.
Councillor Alexander.
I'd like to support what the previous councillors have said. This has been budgeted for, and then, as Councillor Hallett said, doesn't stop something happening in the future. There's not great loads of concrete or anything going in there. So clearly, if they want to lobby for it and get it on the priorities, that would be good. And so what I would like to see, whether these things are on the priorities or not, so that when we spend money, they're based on what priorities we've set. And as Councillor Gontaszewski has said, you know, get on with it and do it and spend the money as budgeted.
Thank you, councillors. Councillor Warner.
Oh, really, I'm just following up with what everyone else has said. I completely agree with them. I like to see this as maybe a potential first step, and if there is support and ideas coming forward, that we can maybe develop this a bit further with more budget action down the path. I also I'm confused about the two questions that were asked in the community consultation. One was, do you live or own property in Vincent, and then do you live or own property in North Perth? They seem to be repetitive to me, so I don't know if I'm misunderstanding those or not, but aside from that, yeah, I support that we go ahead with this and get on with it.
Thank you. Councillor Apollo.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I was considering a motion to defer on the basis of getting additional community consultation, but I can see, based on comments already made by councillors, that would be defeated. So I'm not going to waste anyone's time. I just want to make the point is that we went through an AGM recently where probably the overriding comment coming from those in attendance from the community electors was that they valued more and better community consultation. And I think that is the answer to getting people to vote and in their local government. It's community engagement, not whether they have to do it or not. But the point being, on this motion, there was some in public question time at the briefing, comments made about residents wanted greater community consultation, and I just want to acknowledge the feedback that those residents gave, even though it looks like this is going to be passed as is. Thank you.
Councillors. Councillor Wallace.
I better say my piece, seeing as everyone else has. I probably would have supported a motion for deferral. I'm pretty disappointed with the outcome here. What I took from the public consultation with the two options that was presented was that grass is preferred over hard stand and not much else. We don't get an opportunity to make a new park very often. You know, here's one. I understand from that business perspective that we set a pretty tight budget in our original requests, which is probably on us to an extent. Yeah, I wish we did a little bit more, but you know, as it stands, it'll be a great improvement over what's there, and hopefully brings the local community some enjoyment.
Okay, I'll speak to it. Look, on this, I went back through the consultation and reflected on the consultation that had happened to sort of bring us to this point. So look, it started by raising with the local community whether we'd actually put this lot up for sale. There was a strong response from the community, and that response was that was not wanted. And council responded to that by saying, okay, we're not going to sell the park. There was a lot of feedback received at that time about the condition of the park, the fact that trees had been lost in storms and not replaced, and that they wanted the park to be returned to what it was. And my reading of that at the time was that this was a park that had shade from trees, was natural, didn't have a lot of facility. And, you know, as the Director of Strategy and Development has outlined, it is a local open space, and we have a policy around what that then attracts in terms of the level of facility. It is the case that as a council, we had a resolution that we would eco-zone the park, that we would put $10,000 towards it. And it was really council's instruction to administration to consult with the community on the eco-zoning. So, you know, to be fair, the purpose of the consultation was around eco-zoning the park. And when the park was determined to be kept, it became part of our eco-zoning program, which we have across the City of Vincent. And part of that is about increasing, reducing our groundwater use, taking out some turf, putting in native plants to be water-wise, but it also is a really beautiful aspect of our parks and gardens. So when I went back through the consultation and looked at the results, yes, the community was asked to provide comments on two options, and then there was an open comment box. So 19 respondents, I think it was 19, but then there must have been 20 because it says 19 were in favour of having the park eco-zoned, and 15 were in favour of option 2. And then the comments talk about mainly comments around having a fence, potentially to make it more dog friendly. I think there were 4 comments around having a fence for dogs, 1 comment saying they would not like it to be a fenced area and become very much a dog exercise area. There are requests for benches which are incorporated, and Parks has said that they will attempt to add more through log seating. So apart from the fencing, I didn't see much there that hadn't really been listened to. There is a jacaranda issue, and that's been raised by Councillor Hallett. But you know, in terms of actually saying to administration, we want to consult with the community on how we eco-zone the park at a local open space. And we've gone and done a survey with the community, and it's been letterbox dropped, and people who previously corresponded received an email. You know, we also do have a brand new engagement strategy that talks about how we consult and the scale of consultation, reflecting the purpose and the scale of the work that we're going to do. So just going back through all of that again, I feel that the consultation has been done in accordance with Council's resolution to eco-zone the park. And I think that the steps taken to make the community aware of that were good, including on-site signage, which I think we're finding is a very useful addition, which we haven't done so much. So think about the fact that we're spending $10,000, which is on budget. We've paid for a sign to go in the park. We've done the letter drop. We've emailed a highly engaged community, because when this land was up for sale, there was a lot of engagement around that. So I think, you know, I've gone back over it and reread every comment written, and I'm pretty comfortable with with where the city's landed. And if over time, as Councillor Gontaszewski has said, the community wants to propose new things, there's always opportunities to do that, and there's always ability for council to consider that in future. But predominantly getting in the trees and the eco-zoning and bringing up the amenity of that park immediately is something I'm very keen to see us do as soon as the planting season allows us to. Who moved the motion? Forgotten. Do you like to close debate? Okay, I'll put the Councillor Loden, you're the only one who hasn't spoken. Do you wish to comment?
I don't feel I need to comment as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Councillor Ipley voting against. Councillor Ipley and Councillor Alexander voting against. I declare the motion carried.
Mayor Cole, I've reset the microphone. I'm reasonably confident your microphone will be working up here now.
I like it down here. Are you sure, or do we need IT to give it a good test tomorrow?
No, I'm very sure it's working because I've reset it at the base.
I can confirm that I heard the CEO then.
Thank you for your confirmation, Councillor Durden.
Okay, that takes us to item 10.2, Britannia Reserve Lighting Project change of scope request. Can I have a move and seconder, please? Anyone? Anyone who hasn't moved an item would like to tonight? Councillor Gontaszewski, thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Castle, thank you.
This is a lot of money, but ultimately I'm supportive of this change of scope request. I ultimately understand that we're in a challenging environment with construction costs, and I think that we can probably expect a bit more of this. And I think ultimately it's I think that it is appropriate for us to deliver as we promised, and I'm thankful. I'm pleased at least that we're getting this request now, and I'd prefer to receive these requests now rather than sort of waiting for mid-year review, where essentially we've kind of already made a decision. I'd rather to see a report coming forward like this. So I think that this is what we need to expect these sort of out of review cycle items to come forward if we have additional funds that need to be allocated in this current high pressure environment.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. Look, I agree. I think it's obviously disappointing that that the budget has blown out on this project, but in this environment, it doesn't seem surprising. And I agree that it's good that we're seeing these scope change requests coming through, as we've been discussing for quite some time, the process for that. So it's really positive to see that we're able to respond and make decisions as we go rather than after the fact. I think it is a really important amenity that we're providing to the community, and we have had this discussion with the community about lighting the entire area. So I do think it's appropriate that we continue with that project as planned, albeit with considerable about more money needed.
Councillor Alexander.
No, look, I have some concerns because this is just one request, and it's versus what? What other priorities are there? We're getting this one with some savings put to us, and it's put to us in isolation I would like to see what the other priorities in the city are. And we talk about this environment. How long can we keep talking about this environment and use the pandemic as the reason for all these overruns? We all, know builders and people who are having their issues, and they're making considerations for the pandemic, and knowing that materials are hard to get hold of and workers are hard to get hold of. So this has been going on for a couple of years now. They're significant overruns. So I would really like to know what other areas. I go to Leederville Oval. That's falling down. I think it almost needs to be condemned. Then I look at what are the savings. There's a savings of $100,000 on works at Leederville Oval. What priorities are there? What priorities are at the other areas? So what I would request is to better understand what other areas in the city of Vincent are under pressure. And then when they're listed and we all sit down and look at what we've got, Britannia lighting is then the best buy, then I'd feel more confident in that I knew what was going on in the city of Vincent and the budgeting, because it just seems pretty loose sometimes.
Executive, just to provide any response in relation to priorities.
Through my call. So we are going through the capital works program now for this year and for next year, and it'll be subject to the mid-year review. I think the problem with this project is that we're up against a tight timescale with the grant funding, and the concern is if we don't have a decision to proceed very quickly, then we may lose the grant funding. So that's why this is, if you like, out of sequence. In terms of Leederville Oval, I mean, $1.1 million is budgeted. Well, it's not budgeted, but it's in next year's capital works program to be confirmed through the annual budget process for lighting. So similar project to this to light the oval. So there is money being spent on some other significant infrastructure, including Leederville Oval.
Councillors, Councillor Arthur.
Thanks. This was a late agenda item for the briefing, so apologies for not raising these questions at that time. I've got a few. It says under the heading risk management implications for this item, it says there is a potential project risk that if the construction is not completed before 30 June 2022, the Lcri Grant funding of $500,000 will be retracted. What's the current status of that risk at the moment?
Through Nicole, it's difficult to say current risk. The current situation is that we have to spend the money, complete the project by that date, the end of this financial year, the 30th of June. In terms of delivering the project, we've spoken to the preferred contractor who said that they can deliver it by the end of the financial year if they were to get a confirmation very, very soon, so this week.
Okay, so the risk is low, you're saying. What measures...
Sorry, Nicole, provided that we get a decision quickly, we confirm with the contractor, and they can order the poles. That's one of the delays, and they're confident they'll deliver it this year and we won't lose the grant.
And given the supplier or the contractor has said that they should be able to meet that deadline, has administration undertaken to mitigate that risk by having any penalties on the supplier should they not be able to meet the delivery by that date?
Through Nicola, I don't believe so. What we did was that the tenders were required to, not the tenders, but the people who made submissions were required to confirm that they could complete it this financial year. So I'm not sure there are any penalties in the contract for not delivering.
The other risk identified here and the risk implications is the risk of not being able to progress the work because of COVID-19 restrictions, preventing the contractors from completing the project on time. Is COVID risk in that circumstance, is that an insurable event for the city so that against the loss of the grant?
That's really Nicole. I don't know the answer to that question. It's insurable.
Councillor Upload, you finished?
is there anything can be done to mitigate the risks that you've identified in this document?
Yes, we may call to be able to proceed very quickly this week and place that purchase order for the original scope. And that's the way to mitigate the risk. We've already met with the contractor last week and the week before. They're ready to go, finalising design, ready to place an order. So we just need that decision. That's the best way we can mitigate the risk.
Okay, what we're proposing here is to increase the scope of the project, and I think a big part of that is the $500,000 grant. And it just sounds like we're not prepared. Are we saying that the administration is saying that it's not prepared or doesn't think it has enough time to try and mitigate that risk with the suppliers by saying that even though they believe they can meet the deadline for completion, being 30 June 2022, that we're not going to ask them to have a penalty clause in the project that can in some way wholly or partially mitigate the risk that we won't receive a $500,000 grant?
Through Nicole, I think what I'm saying is I can't answer the question right now, but I can certainly ask that question tomorrow.
Councillor Opolo, can you just indicate if you've finished asking questions or you've finished your debate? Okay, yes?
I'd like to propose we can keep the discussion going, but I'd like to consider proposing a motion to amend this request.
Do you have some words or do you wish to have some time to put that together? And I can continue to other council members while you do that, if you need more time.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, so councillors who haven't spoken on this item, who would like to speak to it? Right, I'll fill the gap. Look, it is not. Oh, Dan, Councillor Lader, come on down.
Thank you. So I think there's a little bit of a lag. Look, I'm supportive of this application. I think there's been some big changes in Britannia in the last couple of years, and they've really changed the way they're working and engaging with the community. The participation that we're seeing is increasing dramatically. They've got a women's team. So just to clarify, because I missed the very start of the meeting, my declaration was included at the beginning. Is that right, CEO?
Through Michael, yes, and it's included in the agenda papers for tonight's meeting.
Right, thanks very much. So the club is doing some great work there, and they do need this capacity to expand. So I think it is a necessary thing, and I think we will see value back to the community as a result of this. There's an efficiency in doing the 6 rather than the 4 at this point in time, so that makes sense to me. Otherwise, we risk having to spend money later to go back and add these into the scope. So from my perspective, I support the recommendation. I'll be interested to hear what Councillor Apple has to say around management risk. I suspect it will be challenging to get a contractor to accept any infringement of a level of this significance on not getting a $100,000 grant. So that may in itself create its own risk, but I will listen to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Loden. Just on the substantive motion, it is concerning when you do see an escalation in cost. I think this is a 25% increase. I think some preliminary questions asked around this demonstrated that the city did engage a quantity surveyor to undertake this work, and that it was costed externally by a qualified quantity surveyor, and that was some 6 months prior, and in that time we've seen this increase in cost. It does raise questions around the city's capital works program, and we have requested to have that brought forward for discussion at a budget workshop to consider other projects that may be at risk of cost increases of this magnitude, and what that means for our capital works program and where we need to prioritise. So that discussion does need to happen. That is a concern, and that is what administration has undertaken to do in response to that. There is obviously the question of the Lcri grant, and when we receive these federal grants, there are often timeframes attached to them. I agree with Councillor Loden that if we're asking a contractor to bear risk associated with the pandemic on timeframes, that could be tricky. But I think there's also been the experience that one of the industries that's been prioritised for continuing through the pandemic more than others has been construction, and this would be a job that would largely be happening outside. It might be that materials are the issue in terms of supply chains, and I think that it would be difficult to mitigate that risk in the current supply chain issues that we're seeing when you've got floods knocking out rail connections, pandemics, etc. We are living in pretty extreme circumstances at the moment, as my brother in Bridgetown experienced over the weekend. So I think it's unfortunate, but I also accept that we are seeing increasing costs of up to 30% in the construction industry at this time, and that there is Executive Director, I just might go to you because that percentage was, we discussed that, and can you just remind me of the source of that?
Through Mayor Cole, yes, all local governments who have put out tenders recently and failed to secure compliant bids or bids that they could afford, when they've reissued those tenders, they're seeing major cost escalation on the same scope. And that's probably going to be hampered by some of the supply issues we've seen now, with the rail freight network being cut off from the East Coast as well. So the sooner that this project could commence, the greater the likelihood that we would avoid the impacts of COVID-related shutdowns or spread that could impact the contractor delivering this as we head into the peak of Omicron.
Thank you, CEO. So look, I do support the recommendation. I share concerns around the fact that this is going to be seen across our capital works program, and it is then incumbent upon us as council members with administration's advice to review our capital works budget and look at what further implications this might bring for what was a very ambitious capital works budget for this financial year. Councillor Apollo, have you got your words prepared? Thank you. Want to ask some questions? Sure.
Thanks, Michael. I just had a question, like what is the proposed delivery schedule, and is fabrication occurring in Western Australia or interstate or overseas?
Through Nicole, my understanding is the poles at least are fabricated abroad, not in Australia. The preferred contractor is preparing final designs, awaiting purchase order this week, final confirmation of the scope, and then we'll place the order as soon as they get that. So we anticipate 12-week delivery. And in the meantime, they'll be on site preparing footings, laying cables, doing all that preparation work while the poles are being manufactured and delivered. So a lot of works will take place even before the poles are delivered, if that makes sense.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Oh, sorry, Councillor Wallace. A different direction. Okay, just in relation to Councillor Wallace's question, are their supply chains currently functional?
So in a meeting that the team had with them last week, they were confident that it would still get delivered. And they were working around Chinese New Year. I think that China is where the poles are being manufactured, but they were confident that they would get them delivered.
Councillor Wallace.
Thanks, Michael. It's a really significant budget change. I think it's closer to a 50% increase than it is 30. But my only comment is, like, you know, we've complied with our procurement policy. I do agree that there's, you know, escalating costs in the private sector for the delivery of these kind of things. I guess I would have liked to have seen us step outside the Walter panel, given that it's a 42% increase I calculated. kind of an exceptional circumstance, but yeah, I accept admin's reasoning, I guess, that this is the best that we can do.
Councillor Appley.
Okay. Sorry. So the motion for amendment is under recommendation, where it reads that council 1 approves, 2 approves, that a point after paragraph 2 is inserted, reading subject to financial mitigation being received, that the supplier agrees that it will complete the works by 30 June 2022 as indicated. And in the event that delivery is not achieved by this date for any reason other than a force majeure or act of God, that the supplier agrees to discount the price by 10%. And just talking to that amendment, clearly that's not going to make up for a loss of a $500,000.
I just need to get a seconder.
Oh, sorry.
Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Wallace.
So it's a notional or nominal penalty. The supplier's already said that they can meet the time frame from which we would be entitled to a $500,000 grant. We're waiving a situation where, due to force majeure, and I would have thought the COVID-19 restrictions on being able to do the work would fall under force majeure. So this is really a situation where, through their own fault, that they would incur a penalty of, and I'm calling it a modest 10%, just so that they are vested in us achieving the result, which is increasing a scope of works and being entitled to a $500,000 grant.
Councillor Wallace.
Thanks, Michael. I think I'm pretty supportive of the intent of the amendment. We're allocating $320,000 here tonight to this project. Some concerns about where else that money could be spent if we don't get this grant and it then costs another $500,000. I think we have equal or even greater concerns about where potentially that money could also be spent. Noting the great work that Britannia is doing and the kind of growing attendance down there. As to whether it's just practical and negotiable with the supplier, I may have to defer to admin on that, but yeah, I'm generally supportive, I think.
Do you have a question for the administration of whether it's, what was the word, practical and enforceable?
That's my question, thank you.
Through Mayor Cole, can I just seek a clarification from Councillor Arpalu whether a COVID-related impact would either on the supply or on the operations, whether a pandemic like COVID would fit within your definition of an act of God or force majeure?
It's a legal question for a lawyer to answer, but I would expect that a pandemic restricting supply chain would probably fall within force majeure.
Yeah, so through my call, if I answer the question, I think that if we introduce a condition like this quite late in the day and the contractor refuses to accept it, I think we'll have nowhere to turn. The other contractors are more expensive, so we'll just have nowhere to turn and the project won't proceed. So I think that's probably the risk. As I said, we could ask, but if they say no, I mean, if the council resolution is to proceed only on that basis and the contractor says no, I think we have nowhere to go in terms of a negotiation.
Can I just ask a question back, please? So I wasn't here when this was originally proposed. I guess the question was, when it was originally proposed, what relevance and significance was placed on council approving the spend at the full scope? Was it subject to, or did they have regard to the fact that they were getting a $500,000 grant? And if they were, I feel like we're incumbent, if we're changing the scope now to increase our spend, that we don't just disregard such a large portion of funding, which is pretty much covering the bulk, more than 50% of the actual cost.
Yeah, so through Nicole, maybe as a little point of clarification, what we're asking to do is the original scope. So this is the original scope that council approved, including the $500,000 grant with a contribution from the city, because the quotations have gone back above the budget. That's why we're seeking additional monies to complete the project as originally scoped. The grant comes to the city to do the work as we originally scoped and what we originally applied for. You know, this is not additional work on top, and the contractor doesn't get the grant, it's the city grant, if that makes sense. So in terms of council making a decision, this scope that we're proposing, the original scope was what council originally agreed when we set the budget. It's just that the budget is not enough to complete that original scope.
And my question is, did council at the time when they approved this original scope, did they take into account that a $500,000 grant was available?
Yes, through Nicole, yes, that's exactly it. We allocated the grant for the project.
So that's my point. I think from a fiscal...
you can only ask questions at this point, Councillor Opolo. I'm going on to Councillor Gonchevsky.
I'm going to follow on from Councillor for those questions though, because I do actually have some strong support with this amendment. I just want to get some clarification in relation to the $500,000 grant. This may come from working in government and, you know, and also through Vincent in terms of sometimes when we've, when there are dates and deadlines, etc., there is occasionally some scope to, you know, seek, you know, some small variation or some consideration, etc. I guess, is administration of a position that if the city was to be largely progressed down the path of delivering this original scope that aligns with the scope that the grant was obtained upon, but there were issues in delivery, etc., and we weren't going to meet the timeline of having everything packaged up by 30 June. What capacity is there for the city to seek some minor variation to the terms of the grant, as we sometimes see here at the city, where we issue a grant and we're unable to acquit by the deadline, but we've made decisions ourselves in the past to vary the terms of such a grant to allow a meaningful project to be completed. Could I just get some advice on that in terms of experience and also perhaps the terms?
Yeah, so through Nicole, what you described, we absolutely would ask for an extension effectively. So if the works are well underway, but it was looking like we wouldn't complete the works in time for whatever reason, we would absolutely go back to the federal funding body and ask for that extension. We would hope that they'd be reasonable. I mean, these grants are for additional infrastructure projects to spur the economy, and we would hope that they would agree to that request. I mean, I can't guarantee it. Currently, the deadline is the end of the financial year, but we would certainly ask. Whatever the situation with delays, supply chains, etc., we would have expected to spend a substantial amount by the end of the financial year anyway. So that could be seen as a claim pending the finalisation of the project.
Thank you. I think that the issue in relation to timeliness of delivery and penalties for not meeting timelines that are put forward in tender responses or timelines that the city specifies in our requests for quote or our tender documentation is absolutely valid. So I do have some concerns this late in the piece about putting in penalties. I certainly wouldn't have any issue with requesting that what I understand has potentially been provided, an assurance that has been provided in a verbal meeting is formally documented in some manner. But then again, what's the point in that if you're not going to have a penalty if you breach it? So I am somewhat supportive of this recommendation, and I think that ultimately, if a contractor is unable to provide some written assurance that they'll meet the deadline that they've already verbally told us that they would meet, it's somewhat concerning anyway. But I guess I have my concern in this amendment ultimately relies on the fact that I suspect that, you know, seeking to include contract terms would potentially lead to a, you know, some sort of legal process or some sort of, you know, needing to seek advice on new terms. And I guess I'll just ask a question of administration in relation to, based on the wording that's proposed, is the, would this be something that administration would be seeking to receive confirmation in writing, or would it be seeking to have to vary the terms of the agreement so that this was included within that as a as part of the contract of or the, you know, the purchase order?
Through Nicole, I'm not sure I quite captured the question.
So good. My question is, are you, if this amendment was to pass, would you be seeking this financial mitigation through just sending an email to the person that you spoke to on the phone along the lines of, as per our discussion, you know, can you provide financial mitigation that this will be complete by 30 June? Or is this something that then, because it contains penalties, needs to be incorporated into the contract itself?
Yes, through Nicole, ultimately to have any effect, it would have to be in the contract.
Through Nicole, I'm aware from the procurement team that we did commission Jackson McDonald to create a contract for the purpose of this particular piece of work. I don't know the detail of the contract, I wasn't involved in it, but we have received legal advice on the crafting of that contract, and I'm a little bit concerned that we potentially are trying to introduce clauses in this conversation that potentially could be in conflict with what we're receiving in terms of our legal advice.
Yeah, through Nicole, if I extend out, this is not a condition that we were upfront about. So it's not a condition that the contract is expecting. So it wouldn't be in the contract currently. So if council were to amend as recommended or suggested, then it would have to be a discussion. It would have to be inserted in the contract, and it would rely upon the company signing that contract, which I suspect they, you know, wouldn't wish to do at this late stage. So.
Are you asking questions, Councillor Opolo?
Waive the procedure, the meeting procedures relevant to a person not being able to speak twice to an amendment on the basis that Councillor Chesney brought new information, which has now triggered another question that's relevant to the current motion.
You're able to ask questions. So if you wish to ask a question, you're entitled to. You can ask another question. You just can't debate.
Just clarify, last time you said no.
No, I said no, you could only ask questions, no further debate.
Yeah. So my question is,
can you use your microphone, please?
My question, thank you, Madam Mayor. My question to administration on this point, should this amendment not proceed, is there a possibility that the grant is we're still eligible for the grant if there was a danger that the work couldn't be completed by 30 June, that the grant would still be eligible, but on a lower sum, because we're saying that the piece of works is actually less than the full scope of works. So that what I'm saying is we would still be entitled to a good portion of the grant, but just not the whole thing because of some part that wasn't delivered after 30 June.
So Nicole, it's a difficult question to answer. My understanding is the grant is for the full works to be completed. So I'm not sure that we would get agreement to get partial grant if the work wasn't completed. I'm not saying that we wouldn't. I'm saying I'm not sure that we would.
Councillor Alexander, you indicated previously that you wish to speak to this amendment. Do you still wish to speak to it?
Oh, it was actually a trivial question, but LRCI, I presume, stands for Lighting Renewal. What?
Through Nicole, it's a federal government program, local roads and community infrastructure program.
Okay. I just, perhaps in future when you're doing documents and you get some 4-letter thing like that, it could be expanded in the first part. And sorry, as I said, it was
Accept that point. We should have
No,
defined
it's
it.
a world of acronyms and you need to use, any government documents should outline in full before then reverting to the acronym. I agree. Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Can I ask for the wording to be up on the screen again? I just want to ask some questions.
Mayor Colco, just quickly comment that I'm looking at the eligibility criteria for LRCI. It does say the eligible construction time period is set out in the program guidelines, etc. The guidelines provide the ability for the department to agree to extend the eligible construction time period in exceptional circumstances. The department considers that natural disasters and the continuation of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the impact of the Delta variant across Australia, are exceptional and unforeseeable circumstances. And there was an agreement to extend that criteria, but it says no further extensions will be granted past the date of 30 June 2022. Any projects not completed by 30 June 2022 may not receive the remainder of the funding allocation under those phases.
Councillor Castle.
I think you might have answered some of my question there. Thank you, CEO. I have, because I can ask this question to administration, I just want to clarify your understanding of how the amendment reads. In particular, the part that says except force majeure or act of God, force majeure has got an E on the end, by the way, does that mean that this clause would not be activated in case of force majeure?
Yes, Nicole, I'm not a lawyer, but that's my understanding. If it was force majeure, the real question is what is force majeure, and that is a legal question that we'd have to take advice on. So if an event happened, Delta, Omicron, floods on, it would be a legal question about whether that was force majeure.
So the way I think I understand this as worded is it's saying that where delivery is not achieved for a reason that's not force majeure, and in this case we're contemplating COVID restrictions or issues as force majeure, that is when it would be the clause would be triggered.
That's Nicole, yeah, that's my understanding too. Triggered. So if there was an event, so if the project was delayed beyond June, the contractor will be expected to give us that 10%, that financial mitigation, unless there was a force majeure, was shown to be force majeure. The danger is that we have to get the contractor to agree that as a clause, which I suspect they won't at this stage.
Yeah. Look, I have reservations about this. I think it is risky in itself to try and introduce this clause at this late stage, and by trying to mitigate one risk, we might create another. I think there is a very open legal question as to whether COVID is still considered force majeure, given that this pandemic has been around for 2 years. I don't know that a new contract now could actually contemplate that COVID is an unexpected event. So I think there's too many questions for me in the way it's worded and in the timing of this to support the amendment. I do understand the intent, and I do think that it's something that we're going to have to contend with going forward, and knowing that perhaps this sort of clause should be a regular part of our contract for any new projects that we're developing. But I think that if we present this to the supplier at this late stage, we run the risk that the whole project collapses.
Councillors, any final comments on the amendment? Councillor Alexander, you have spoken, so you will just be entitled to ask a question. Councillor Warner.
I just want to back up what Councillor Castle's saying, and I completely respect and appreciate what Councillor Iopolo is intending here, and I think that should always be a part of our tender process. But I do think this is a bit late. I think it will create more problems than it will solve. But I was also seeking clarification from the CEO from what you just read out about the risk of them not supporting this past 30th of June. Are you saying that it's pretty black and white there, that if we don't deliver 100% by the 30th of June, that there's no flexibility there?
Through Mayor Cole, that's what the published guidelines say, and all local governments across Australia are participating in this program. So they did extend by 6 months, I think, the delivery timeframe. We initially thought we were considering whether or not we could achieve this by the end of last calendar year. The extension was granted to all local governments, and that gives us enough time to deliver this financial year.
Would you expect any further flexibility there, though, given that they cite the Delta strain there, that things keep evolving, that there might be flexibility here so that we might actually not have a problem to deal with?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I couldn't speak on behalf of the federal government and what they want to do about these guidelines. Yes, there's a federal election between now and the end of this grant program, and to provide a comment rather than formal advice, there will be quite a large number of federal members of parliament across Australia wanting to open these projects and see them delivered in the next few months, not on the 1st of July or any time after that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councillors, any further comments for those who haven't already spoken? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? All those against? No, you don't get a right of reply on an amendment. Do you wish to vote in favour of your amendment? Okay. Councillor Iopolo in favour, all those against? Declare it lost. We're back to the substantive. Are there any further amendments? Councillor Gonchevsky.
I don't have an amendment, and I'd like to speak to closed debate if there's no further. Everyone else has spoken. Look, I just want to say that whilst I didn't support the amendment, I thank Councillor Iopolo for focusing the discussion on risk. Where I've landed on this is that this really is a risk around whether we've left it too late to kick off. And so I guess just for my final question, could I please get a percentage likelihood on the basis of, if the order was to go in today, the estimate based on, from administration, a likelihood that the works will not be complete in order for us to receive the Lcri grant?
I'm not sure I want to put a percentage on it. The contractor has told us if they can proceed immediately, they are confident they will deliver by the end of the financial year. So I don't know how to interpret that as that's 100% that we're confident. I mean, it's hard to read the future.
So in terms of the city's risk management framework, which requires us to consider likelihood and consequence, we know what the consequence is. Can I just get an information from administration as to what the assessment of the likelihood is that the works will not be completed in time for the city to be able to access the $500,000 grant, if the order is put in this week?
I've got the risk management framework in front of me, but it's based on what we know now, that risk is low.
Okay, well, on the basis of the advice that I've just been given, and also on the fact that I do accept that there is a need for improved lighting at Britannia Reserve, and that I'm unsure of future grant rounds that may be coming up, because there's been quite a lot of expenditure through this early phases of this pandemic. And I would rather that there is a chance, and I think a reasonable chance, that the city's not on the hook for $1 million, we're only on the hook for 500 and 70. So I'm supportive of this recommendation, but I do think that this has been a useful debate.
That closes debate, and I just do need to note that this is an absolute majority decision because it is a decision of allocating funding. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Councillor Opolo voting against. I declare the motion carried. That takes us to item 11.7, 3-year funding agreement for the YWA. Moved by Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you. I'm happy to support this for a few reasons. One is that the Y does some extraordinary work over an extended period of time with particularly vulnerable young people in Vincent. But specifically, previously working in the community sector, one of the ongoing challenges is the lack of recurring funding and long-term planning being able to be achieved in the community sector because of grants being relatively short. So that has implications on staffing, on continuity, and it's great to have an opportunity for the Y to be able to plan 3 years ahead. So very happy to support this. And just wanted to ask, in terms of the query that I had in the briefing notes about implications for or requirements for community funding recipients, and just wondering if there'll be opportunity for council to comment on any draft changes around the public health requirements.
Through Mayor Cole, I think we've, in the briefing notes, we did make a comment that we didn't see. In fact, I think there is positive public health outcomes, which I think is probably what you're indicating, Councillor Hallett.
Sorry, yeah, just to clarify that was the broader satisfactory response in the notes. It was just mentioned in the notes that you were doing a review of community grant recipients' requirements around public health for the future, and just whether we can contribute to some of that as well.
Yeah, I'll take that one on notice, but I acknowledge the desire to be involved. Thank you.
Councillor Gontaszewski.
Just briefly, yeah, look, I've been on council since 2015 and I don't recall us having a year where we haven't funded, you know, the Y. And so I think this is reasonable. I also think that we've, in terms of ensuring that we have a service that targets Vincent youth, I think that that's important. But I guess also, I think one of the things that's important is that we have a service in Vincent that is accessible and open and accessible to youth more broadly, and that includes youth in Vincent. So I'm happy to support this. And I think there's a couple of other organisations that may benefit from this model.
Councillor Warner.
Yeah, thank you to Councillor Hallett for what he said about not-for-profit organisations, and I certainly appreciate that because it's absolutely the case. I was really curious to know if this would be the first triennial funding for a not-for-profit that Vincent has engaged in, and if it is, does that then set a precedent for future prospects? Through Mayor Cole, we were directly approached by YWA, and in terms of our relationship with them and looking at the Youth Action Plan and the key part that they play in the delivery of that action plan, it certainly had a reasonable context. The community development team is looking at whether or not there are similar scenarios where a multi-year grant may be mutually beneficial for the city and for the not-for-profit organisation. I don't see that as a widespread practice, but there may be a small number of organisations that have long-term relationships and are deeply embedded in our service delivery model where that would make sense. So we're sort of looking at that at the moment. Thank you. I think that's a terrific thing. I really support this proposal, and I look forward to seeing it being able to be a potential thing for not everybody. It's not relevant to everything, but there's specific projects that could actually be very beneficial.
Councillors? Councillor Castle?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, absolutely supportive of this recommendation. I've had quite a bit to do with representatives of the Y through the Children and Young People's Advisory Group for the last 4 years. And they are a critical partnership for the city. That actually not only will this kind of funding allow them to plan and to deliver programs to a greater degree than if the same amount of money was provided year on year. I think they also go a long way to delivering some of the priorities and the objectives that we've set out in our own policies and plans, particularly the Youth Action Plan, in particular around mental health, which was a key theme of that plan. And I think that what we can do to support them in delivering that is essential for a local government and for the City of Vincent. And I think this is a really great way to strengthen that partnership with them and ensure that young people are provided for the next 3 years at least.
Councillors, any further comments? Councillor Alexander?
Just briefly, I absolutely support that because not-for-profits and getting 3-year funding gives them a chance to hang on to staff. And I suspect City of Vincent, we should look at any similar ones and do likewise.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Any further comments? I support the comments that have been made. I think this is good, and I agree that it would be good to continue this across our long-standing partnerships where we have funded people for many, many years on an annual basis. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried. That was the last item of business under our reports. There are no motions of which previous notice have been given, and there is no confidential items. So I thank you all for your attendance this evening and declare the meeting closed at 8:26 p.m.